Hi class, this week we're looking at how to study biblical leaders from the Old Testament. In this video, I want to cover a few common issues that we'll confront as we study Old Testament leaders. Note that when we talk about Old Testament leadership studies, we're usually, but not always, talking about figures from the Old Testament genre of narrative, not necessarily from prophecy or wisdom literature. Although you can certainly do studies on leaders from those genres, it's just not common. When studying these kinds of leaders, you'll use many of the principles that you learned in hermeneutics. But here are the most important things to consider. First is the cultural context. Just like in hermeneutics, we have to deal with understanding how the world of the Old Testament differs from our own. We can use some of the same Old Testament study tools to gain a deeper understanding of the cultural context in which the Old Testament leaders lived and faced leadership dilemmas. Common things that we should think about include religious differences and norms, gender roles, and political differences. Think for a moment about Queen Esther as a servant leader. What roles did religion and gender play into her experience as a leader? When we think about what principles we might derive from Esther's experience, we want to consider these key aspects of her story. Next is the physical context. Again, this is something you should consider anyway when applying good hermeneutics to biblical study, but it's also very helpful to understand the geographic context of an area when we study it. For instance, when we read about going up to Jerusalem, what do we picture? Understanding the physical context of a time and of a place helps us put ourselves in the shoes of the original leader. While it's not as important as cultural context, we should still consider it as we study OT leaders. Think for a moment about Jonathan and his armor bearer in 1 Samuel 14. When we understand the real-world location of that battle, we can understand that Jonathan and his armor bearer had to climb down into a canyon and then back out in order to confront their enemy. They were exposed on the way down. Understanding the physical context helps us place the leaders in their real-world situations. Next is the linguistic context. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, which is already a highly poetic language. Add to that the fact that translation is somewhat subjective, and you have a recipe for misunderstanding. Therefore, it's important to rely upon commentaries and other secondary sources to fill in our knowledge about a particular Old Testament leader. When you consider these contexts, you can apply the same principles that you learn in hermeneutics to the study of Old Testament leaders. We have to work to bridge the cultural gap between our understanding of the world and the world as it existed during the Old Testament. The differences are immense. How did people view religion and belief? For one, gods were tied to a given city or region, so that when you conquered an enemy and captured their idols, it was understood that you were removing their gods from their midst. What about gender roles? This is especially the case when we study female biblical leaders like Esther, Ruth, and Hannah. You could also consider political differences. How did societies function both domestically and internationally? These are just some of the examples of the differences between the Old Testament and today. When we think about Old Testament leaders, we have to frame them in their own context before we can draw applications that'll help us with our own leadership journeys. I also want to point out an aspect of Old Testament leadership studies that really apply to all leadership studies, both historical and biblical, but it's the possibility to learn from the negative. When we study King David, who's one of the most widely studied Old Testament leaders, we can learn not just from his faithfulness, not just from his military successes or his rule. We can also learn from his greatest failures, his relationship with his son Absalom and his affair with Bathsheba. Even in the negative, we can learn from Old Testament leaders. Saul's an even greater example of negative leadership attributes in the Old Testament. His jealousy of David that drove him to murderous rage and his impatience are the most obvious examples. See, most historical and biblical leaders live in a gray area, meaning that they had both victories and failures, technically and morally. I want to leave you with the idea that just because a leader isn't necessarily someone you want to emulate, you can still learn from their leadership journey and apply it to your own.